The Open University are working closely with the National Trust to help restore floodplain meadows like this one in the Attingham estate in Shropshire. Part of this project, we're looking at how National Trust collections can help us think about these spaces from a cultural and historical perspective. I think if you're interested in bridging or even blurring the worlds of art and science or culture and nature, then I think the National Trust is the perfect place to start, because on the one hand you've got these amazing houses and collections, but on the other hand you've also got this land which encompasses such a wide variety of habitats. And it's easy to see these things as separate, the houses and the land, but that's just not the case. Just as humans shape the environment around them, so too does the environment shape humans. So the land is part of our culture, and many historic objects in National Trust collections reflect this. Wouldn't it be nice to take these objects and artworks out of collections and deposit them in the landscape? If not literally, then at least imaginatively.
The Nature Recovery Project at Attingham is a 10-year project to reassess how we use land across the estate. We're about 4,000 acres, which is about 1,600 hectares. And if you think about the main estate that people come to see, the parkland, the house and these sort of surrounds, the pleasure grounds, that's about a quarter of the estate. So we've got much more land that we can work with. And that's almost exclusively tenanted by farmers. So we've got a big opportunity to work with our tenant farmers there to see how much more we can do for nature alongside the farming that they're doing. Where can we build in more woodlands, more trees, more meadows, more individual trees, wetlands, those sorts of things. We've got loads of different habitats across the estate, and we want to do more of them. We want them to be better joined up. Meadows are really important generally in the landscape. We've lost around 98% of them over the last 100 years, and they provide a great source for all sorts of nature species. Bumblebees, honeybees, dragonflies, all the different flies, birds, bats. They provide such an interesting habitat. The plants themselves, which of course have value, floodplains provide so much for them. Floodplains provide structure to the soil so that at times of flood it's actually more likely to stay together and we'll have something growing again the following year. And then sort of culturally they've always been really important to estates, providing a source of hay or fodder or actual grazing, whether for cattle or for horses or for whatever else they might be using, but they've always been there on the estate. In terms of biodiversity, I'd like to see an increase in the number of species generally, and also the number of individuals that we're seeing. So it's not just about having a barn owl, but if we can increase that to a pair of nesting barn owls, that's a real gain. If we have a pair of nesting barn owls and an extra 6 or 7 plant species across the meadows over the next 10 years, that's a real increase in biodiversity. If we think about individual species, then for me, Great Burnet is one of the really exciting plants for floodplain meadows. It always excites me when I see it and when I see it doing better. I love its colour, the depth that it has, that sort of rich red, which you might see in a bottle of wine or something like that. But it's just one of those things that I feel like it's a great indicator of floodplain meadow success. Attingham's had meadows for a very long time. Looking at the old maps, we can see that we've had some meadows for sort of at least a couple of 100 years, and we don't really know what they were before that because our earliest maps are only from the early 1800s. But we can see that we've had meadows here. They've been serving the estate, providing fodder for cattle, for horses, and providing great habitats for the estate's nature species as well.
I
think our collections are a really valuable resource for people, for inspiration and reflection. They're so diverse, as the nature of our properties are very diverse, and to help people realise that we care not only for indoor collections, houses, historic houses and country house collections, but also a whole range of outdoor landscapes. And a lot of that landscape is often quite managed. And so it's not, nature is really important, but it's not just a natural landscape. Man has intervened and continues to intervene. So in the work that we're doing to try to reverse climate change, try and help the nature crisis, I think there are objects in our collections sometimes that might depict species that have already been lost, for example, in Victorian taxidermy collections, but just help people see things in a different way, help them to stop and take time and think about how important these species are to man and how the role that they've played in our places. I think it provides a valuable different perspective. I think people might notice things in decorative arts, fine arts, things that they haven't noticed before. For example, one of our paintings which portrays one of the 5th Lord Berwick's Hereford cattle. He was into animal husbandry and he bred prize-winning Hereford cattle. There they are set in a landscape, and you can see often in the depiction of that, okay, there is some artistic license, but you can see how those landscapes are shown, how they might have evolved. Looking at historic maps and the detail on historic maps showing you where are wetlands, where is woodland, not just woodland but the type of woodland, how those historic landscapes were used and farmed, grazed in the past. They all provide different perspectives and evidence, I think, as to how landscape has evolved historically. We often forget that the house was meant to be seen from the landscape and the landscape was meant to be seen from the house, so the two are very much interconnected. And I think for our visitors today, they can see those two things quite separately, and the way we operate, they can be treated quite separately. But I think it's important to retain that holistic view. So this is Repton's original red book for Attingham, and they're called red books because he bound his proposals for his landscape designs for a client in red Morocco leather, and then it has this beautiful marbled paper inside. And the principle was that it was essentially a way of showing the client what your existing landscape looked like and what it could look like if you followed Repton's proposals for the designs that he came up with. So it's a before and proposed after sort of technique. And it's very much like a sort of children's pop-up book, because it has these ingenious flaps that show the current vision of the landscape and then what it could look like if you followed his suggestions. So I try very carefully to lift up the flap. You see that's the current with this meandering sort of marshiness here, which is actually probably quite nice from your point of view, Paul. And then what it could look like underneath, which is a more sort of coherent flowing river underneath. So I just think it's interesting because Repton has dedicated a whole page here to water. And we were saying earlier that he's coming at this from an aesthetic perspective. So he's very interested in the role that water has to play visually rather than benefit to nature or species. And he has some quite specific views about the majestic need for the effect of a great body of water for a large house to add brilliancy and grandeur to the character of the scenery. So it is not an occasional meandering brook that such a palace or such a bridge requires, but it is an ample river majestically flowing through the park and spreading cheerfulness on all around it. Whereas actually we quite like some meandering and some sort of flood water, marshy ground these days as well, don't we? So again, it's that balance between what his aesthetic spirit and vision was as to what is good for habitats today.
And how can we capture both? Can we have that cheerfulness and almost playfulness with some aspects of the water while still providing those more interesting habitats as it meanders down?
Yeah.
So Paul, when we were in the meadow yesterday, we were talking about lapwings as a possible marker of success for nature recovery, and here's a fantastic lapwing from the 1870s, Gould's Book of British Birds.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? Such an amazing painting or rendering of, I mean, just look at the colour right the way across this sort of, it's almost, it changes so much, so frequently. You can imagine how that would help the camouflage in a meadow or a sort of grassy field. These flecks of red would blend in. We can see in the background. Of course, you've got the fantastic crown at the top. And it's tried to suggest what sort of landscape we might find it in, which is not too dissimilar to a floodplain meadow. I think it's almost estuarine in places, but essentially it's that sort of floodplain area.
So if all goes well in the future, we'll be having lapwings, hopefully, and lapwings chicks like this on the Attingham estate. That'd be great.
Yeah, we hope so. We have seen lapwing on the estate, but what we'd like to see now is more of them. We'd like to see them nesting, whereas we've only seen them visit so far. And if we can see them breeding on the estate in multiple places across the estate, or at least have multiple opportunities across the estate, that's really the goal.
Here we've got a selection of 4 objects from the collection that are quite diverse, but all unified by representing nature in some ways, either in a relatively, I suppose, general way or related to specific species.
It's worth remembering as well that things like the books and all these different artefacts, these are ways of engaging in nature when you might not be able to engage in nature, so they might be a sort of replacement when you're unable in winter. It gets dark very early, you might not be able to go out there and see very much, but actually you might be able to sit here and leaf through a book and enhance your understanding, to learn more, even to just look back at things you may have seen. There are so many different ways that you could use these things to bring out memories or emotions or aspirations. I think it's important not to get too tied down in what we think they were actually for, because I suppose we won't really know, will we?
Yeah, and there's a lovely selection of flowers and grasses on this fan here, and obviously many of those, like the daisies, are only visible at certain times of the year. So as you say, Paul, it links back to kind of in the winter months. It's really lovely to look at a representation of a daisy and remember when it was blooming. Floodplain meadows are hugely resonant spaces. They're part of Britain's agricultural history, part of its social history, and part of its cultural history. And the case for their protection needs to be made again and again, and it needs to be made in a variety of ways. So this requires scientific knowledge and research, but arts and culture have an equally important role to play. Historic objects can help us understand the longer history of our relationship with spaces such as floodplain meadows, but they can also help us imagine and shape the future. To learn more about floodplain meadows, their management and restoration, history and value, and information on how you can get involved, visit the Floodplain Meadows Partnership website at floodplainmeadows.org.uk. If you're interested in volunteering with the National Trust, go to nationaltrust.org.uk/volunteer. This video was funded by the Open University's Open Societal Challenges programme in collaboration with the National Trust.